Benvenuti. È sabato il 4 settembre 2021. Thanks for joining me. This is Jessie and this is my channel, The Caffeinated Bookworm. And if you're just joining my channel, that little Italian at the beginning is because I'm taking an Italian class for college this semester. And so I'm trying to get used to using it conversationally, I suppose. Anyway, today I'm going to be reviewing The Mad Women's Ball by Victoria Mass. This is a rather brutal book. So it takes place in France at the end of the 1800s, and it's at Salpêtrière, which is a hospital for mad women. Now, you have to understand that the term mad woman is a loose term. There's women there who have been taken there because they caught their husband cheating and confronted them, and instead of dealing with the situation, they just had them go into the mental hospital. There's women who were prostitutes. There's women who have suffered horribly at the hands of mostly men. There's women who altruists themselves who were taken there. Women who were taken there by their mother-in-laws for excessive grieving after their husband died. I don't know, the whole thing was just really unnerving. When you have this juxtaposition of medical science and the paranormal. So you have Genevieve, she's basically the head nurse. She's been there for a long time. She's been there for longer than the current doctor. She's been there for longer than most of the other nurses and most of even the patients. She's been there for a really long time. She has stopped viewing these women as human and more like animals, a means to an end when it comes to medical science. She has long ago forsaken religion and traded her religion, such as it was, for medical science. At the same time, you have Eugenie, and Eugenie is a girl. She's living with her father and her mother and her brother and her grandmother. The situation at the house is her father is a lawyer, and there's really no familial connection there between anybody in the household. Her father is a domineering presence. He's a lawyer. When they're at the dinner table, they don't speak until he speaks first. The mother is barely mentioned. She might as well be a painting on the wall for as much as she contributes to family life. The brother is not really close with Eugenie. They're cordial, but that's about the extent of it. They share a name and that's it. Eugenie thinks that she has a friend in her grandmother, and her grandmother does talk to her more than anybody else in the household does. And so when Eugenie is advised to confide in her grandmother, she reluctantly does, and her grandmother immediately turns around and tells the whole story to Eugenie's father. So up until this point, Eugenie is pretty rebellious. She likes to make a scene, basically to get under her father's skin and get a reaction and attention from him. After she talks to her grandmother and really confides in her this thing that's going on in her life, she becomes a little bit more calm. And so one day when they're sitting at breakfast, the father invites Eugenie on a day trip with him and her brother, and Eugenie chalks this up to her being more calm as of late, and she doesn't see any of the red flags. Even on their trip in the carriage, she doesn't sense anything wrong, but then they pull up to Salpêtrière, and she is dragged screaming and crying and begging into this facility. Her brother at this point has, I think this is where he first starts to realize that this is not something that's okay. And so as they drag her in, he eventually abandons his father and his sister and runs out of Salpêtrière. Her father signs the papers over, tells Genevieve that he no longer has a daughter, as far as he's concerned. Eugenie does something to upset Genevieve in the first day, and she's put into isolation. There's other girls there. There's Teresa, who is a former prostitute. She's been there almost as long as Genevieve has, and in fact, they've come to a very near companionship for as long as they've been there and everything that they've seen. There's Louise, who was orphaned at a young age and sent to live with her aunt and uncle, and suffered horrendously under their care. After Genevieve isolates Eugenie, Eugenie slowly starts to chip away at Genevieve with proof that what she's saying is true. And Eugenie is certain that Genevieve is going to help her. So she is showing Genevieve that what she's saying that has landed her in Salpêtrière is not, it's not lies. It's not due to her being crazy or mad or even evil. It's just something that is. And so something in Genevieve's past is touched on by Eugenie, and at that point she starts her Genevieve starts her own transformation. Meanwhile, there's in the background there's a ball coming up. It's the Mad Women's Ball, and this is where the men of high society in France, they come to Salpêtrière and they have a chance to view these mad women up close. Eugenie, in one of her conversations with the doctor, is very clear about how vulgar she believes that this is, how disgusting it is. Also, that Dr. Charcot puts these girls on display in front of audiences, does experiments on them, hypnotizes them, causes them to have these seizures or go into hysterics, and she lets them know in no uncertain terms that this is a disgusting practice and that they've basically made a spectacle of themselves. At which point she's dragged out of the room. We get closer to the night of the ball. It becomes apparent that Genevieve has changed her mind about Eugenie. And so I'm not going to go too much further into this and spoil it, but there were a couple of quotes that I wanted to share with you. There was this moment when Dr. Chalcote had Louise up on stage, and he was doing a hypnosis experiment with her in front of the audience, and caused her to have right lateral hemiplegia, and so her entire right side went paralyzed. And this is a quote from after Genevieve has come back from an excursion or a trip to her hometown to see her father. This is when she comes back to Salpêtrière and what happens. What had shocked her when she first entered was the general inaction of the men present. Louise was lying on the stage, her left arm flailing, crying and pleading for help, and not a single man had intervened, as though they had all been turned to statues by a woman's despair. And that was just absolutely heartbreaking. And at this moment, that is when Genevieve becomes human and starts seeing the girls themselves as human. And she goes to Louise and she holds her in her arms and she cradles her until she stops crying. The story with Louise doesn't really get too much better after this. The rest of it is heartbreaking. And like I said, I'm not gonna ruin the ending for you. It was a really, really intense and brutal book to read. It was well worth the read also. I did see that Prime is either going to release or they have released an adaptation of this. I'd certainly like to watch that. Like I said at the beginning, there's a commentary on how society was at this point in time. There's these places where men go to drink coffee and whiskey and smoke cigars and cigarettes, and there's a quote that says, "The debates are not so much discussions as polite homilies, ideas learned by rote and trotted out by supposedly enlightened minds." And then later, "The proudest minds do not appreciate being contradicted, especially by a woman. These men acknowledge women only when their physical appearance is to their liking." Also, as if intellectual constraints were not sufficient, women had to be hobbled physically, and at this point they're talking about the corsets that the women are made to wear to make their form more likable. It also says, "Madness in men is not the same as that in women. Men use it against others, and women turn it in on themselves." And that is something that is very prevalent in this book. How these women take the pain and suffering and torture and torment that has been bestowed on them their entire lives, and they use it to torture themselves even more. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. So I highly recommend reading this book. I would give it probably 4.5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. And thanks again to NetGalley for providing me with an ARC in exchange for my honest review. So much for watching. Like and subscribe below.